All right. It's Jeff Mayhew. It's John Beatty. It's Politics and Parenting, where we talk about politics, but we talk about it differently. John, how are you doing today?
Doing really well, Jeff. I had a small win this past week. We talk about leaders being able to communicate and listen to the people in their community. And so on the school board, there was this just attendance zone change. As the staff would have put it, it was very run of the mill, only less than 10% of students, but parents were upset about these changes. And so I got a chance to go to a listening session, hear what people thought about it, and then I was able to communicate with my colleagues on the board, and we decided to just sort of not go through this plan at all, just to listen to what people said and then communicate with the community about how the process worked, and then with my colleagues. So it was good to kind of I mean, not that I've not done that before, but I really like, as you go through that, think about what we teach and the fact that like it really is important for our legislators to listen and to get as many facts as possible, and then to communicate back and sort of to communicate to the people that are upset, and it's like that you know it's nothing personal. This is kind of a process that goes forward, and we kind of deal with it, and then this is the steps we can take to fix it. And I think like we'd all benefit from a little bit more like that. But how about you?
It's been a short week because we're doing double duty this week. It's been pretty good. I read a couple books. I read a book on John Bingham, who wrote is the architect really of the 14th Amendment. And I read another book on Polk. You know how much I love to study the antebellum period and then the Gilded Age. Now I'm hitting the Reconstruction period as well. So it's been pretty good. I'm super excited to be able to have an additional guest. And I just want to share with the audience, looking forward to next week. John, did you hear who we booked on the show next week?
Jeff, who do we book? People are going to be excited about this one.
We booked HW Brands to be on the show. I cannot wait to talk to HW Brands. I'm gonna rearrange all these books so I have all of his books out. And I just want to ask him questions about history for like an hour straight. Just be like, what do you think about this?
It'll be good. I can't wait.
But probably, I mean, he might be my favorite historian slash biographer. I just love reading his books. It's awesome. And I know your brother is a fan of his books as well because he's borrowed at least two of mine.
I don't know if I read his books, but I read the article you talked about, and I really appreciate the fact that he talks about sort of narrative history. And I think
Oh,
I've read analytical history books, and it's really dry, and then you read a good narrative history book, and you're like, I get these people. So it'll be good. But
yeah,
before we get, we're putting the horse apart. Who do we have? Who's our guest today?
so our guest today is going to be Thomas Howes, the editor-in-chief of the Vital Center. We had Tyler on the show earlier this week. Tyler was the founder, and now Thomas is kind of taken over as the editor. And as we kind of talked about already, we're big fans. We love to read thoughtful, thought-provoking articles on real issues or real problems that we're facing today. And we're just glad that there's a group of people working in the intellectual circle to like bring people to the center, bring people to compromise, bring people to debate as opposed to whatever we have going on today. All right, John, we're back with a special episode this week. We have another guest, Thomas Howes, editor in chief at the Vital Center. Thomas, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
So we had Tyler on the show just earlier this week. We're big fans of the project you got going on there. I just wanted to, invite as many of you guys on the show to get people talking about the magazine. And as John and I always talk about, politics and parenting are very similar. So just curious, like, what's your background? Do you have kids? Are you married? What are you working on outside of the Vital Center?
Well, I'm married to my wife here in New Jersey, and we have two daughters, 9 and 3. And yeah, no, parenting is probably being a dad and husband are probably my favorite things. So,
Do you find it difficult to balance, being intellectual in the world as far as like thinking about like how the world should be, and then also going down to like the ground level of parenting, of like shaping the and molding the very young minds.
Um, I mean, there's always a time conflict, and but I feel like we have a pretty good balance right now between my wife and I on how we handle that. I guess one issue I have is winding down when I get done with work. My brain it moves fast when I'm thinking about philosophy and all these issues, the things I'm teaching or researching. So keeping the most important thing for me and that I struggle with is putting the phone away and just being present for my kids when I get home. Because my mind wants to keep doing active things.
I think
Yeah, I've
John and
got
I
that
can both
problem too. Like
relate.
my wife has to, ask me what I'm doing to remind me that I should be paying attention to the family and
That's right.
so I know exactly what that's like.
Yeah. I should just
So
hand my
Thomas,
phone to my wife when I get home.
yeah. So Thomas, you wrote an article in the most recent episode, or not episode, I guess publication, called Catholic Scholasticism at the Threshold of Constitutionalism.
Yep.
And it's a great read.
Thank you.
So I definitely appreciate it because I tend to go in those rad trad circles. Wouldn't consider myself a rad trad per se,
Mhm.
which is the radical traditionalist. But I know a lot of people, and I appreciate what the Catholic Church teaches, and I try to stay faithful to it. But
Mhm.
for me, and being in politics, it's I think there is so much that like Catholicism has introduced, and you basically talk about this one particular person, to get the name right as we go. It's where is it? Suarez.
Mhm.
And I'm just kind of, he's in the 17th century. I'm
Yep.
reminded of like Thomas More, who's another great Catholic statesman who
Mhm.
actually was key to getting Parliament to allow, or get Parliament to be free to debate anything without the king being able to come after them for what they say. Like there's a tradition of Catholic scholars and statesmen actually like accentuating modernity per se, rather than modernity being this sort of I don't know, how would you put it, like how people view modernity nowadays.
Well, it depends. But as far as traditional Catholics, they tend to have a pretty negative view of modern modernity as far as modern politics is concerned, or that they have recently, in the last few years, or at least the younger ones. I'm not talking about conservative Catholics, but like the really traditionalist ones have had that tendency in the last few years, I've noticed.
Yeah, I mean, do you think like social media kind of drives that? Because I know like it's like I found like once Pope Francis became Pope, like he went from Benedict to Pope Francis, and there's some people view it as a big shift, and I think
Yeah,
at a small scale, yeah, you can see that. But I mean, like they seem to be pretty faithful Catholics, so I wouldn't say it's too radical. But I think like it's easy to kind of like say like, well, everything that this sort of modernism that Pope Francis is bringing is bad because it's not there, and so we got to get rid of it. And I've heard like there's a two swords theory or something. Like there's a lot of like interesting
yeah.
things you can find on. Do you think like social media kind of accentuates that
I, I
kind of dividing?
I think so. I think so because if everybody finds their own community, and that becomes less people become more comfortable in that community where they're isolated from other intellectual communities and what they're talking about. um I've noticed people within their communities feel less incentive to persuade people anymore, that they're not. And I
Mhm.
think that's bad for the communities themselves, because when you're trying to persuade people, if you want to be successful, you have to listen to other people, and you have to grant them points. Say, hey, that was actually a pretty good point. I can see why why you say that, and then it makes you fine tune your own position, right? Um, but I've seen a lot of these like isolated communities online is that they've kind of abandoned that, and it's just about maintaining the ideological purity within their tribes. Um, and one reason that I spend so much time with this article, where as I emphasized in the beginning, that is a story I wanted young Catholics to know about how complex the real relationship is between the the scholastics like Suarez and the modern politics, is to sort of push back against some of these narratives that, like, everything modern is bad, right? That I feel like a lot of young Catholics are falling into that trap, and I'm a Catholic, so I try to be Orthodox myself. I think of myself as Orthodox. Um, I've I've actually pretty confident I am Orthodox. So even though my positions on politics aren't popular these days, I'm confident they're within the realm of free debate within the church, within our, I'm never going to be censored for them or anything. um, and but so it does matter to me. I would like it. I would like the to be to I would like the church to prosper and persuade people, and I think obsession with ruling over people with radical politics, I think it's not gonna, it's going to hurt that, and it's also going. I don't think it's necessarily good on the souls of people who are promoting it. I don't expect they're going to be in power anytime soon. So.
So you
No, I completely agree with that. Like I see like there's like kind of a both sidesism, perhaps you could say, but both sides are definitely in this like ideological purity. How well can you adhere to the truth? I mean, like I feel like Jeff and I, when we ran for Congress, like was very much like, are you going to say the right talking points? Otherwise, we're just going to exclude you, or you're not good enough for us. So there is definitely a lack of kind of debate and an attempt to actually like persuade people. I'd say, and that, not in the sense of like having to say like, well, okay, I'll grant you that, granting points is sort of saying like, what's the common ground between us? And there's definitely not enough of
Yeah.
that. Like not enough of saying you and I agree on this. I think people tend to say, well, as you're just capitulating and you're giving in, and like you said, like you're diluting the ideological purity of the group, and it's very toxic for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's my experience.
So you mentioned kind of social media as and John asked you about it, social media kind of helping with the isolation. In your article, you go through kind of like the constitutional framework that we have, the checks and balances, and how it kind of weaves in with the Catholic religion and Suarez. Now, what I would say, like looking at it from my perspective, and recently like kind of reading a lot of history, it kind of seems like maybe social media is a result of other things. I feel like, because we're talking about like a lack of debate, which leads to isolation. So when people don't feel like they're being heard, they're going to seek out places where they can be heard, and then they're going to lose their energy of fighting with everybody, and they're just going to give up. And I see it more as like our structure of checks and balances has been, morphed, and a lot of the power is shifted out of Congress to the executive and to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And while we may sometimes get what we want, power keeps on getting shifted, and it keeps on making it difficult for the next generation to like have a say. So, I mean, do you kind of see that in your studies as well, with maybe, because it, like I tell people, parents shape the child and government kind of shapes the people, even though the people are supposed to shape the government, but
Yeah. Yeah, no, I hear you. I think there are some, obviously I'm very, I'm patriotic, and I'm very proud of our country, and I think we live in a great country. But every era has its own problems, and we have our own problems. And I think some of those problems we're seeing show up here with polarization, people feeling like they can't, like you said, they can't speak their opinion, they can't share their opinions in public, because there's such a restrictive public orthodoxy, at least in some contexts, like academia, or in the public square, with popular media, mainstream media, and all that, and that probably leads them to these isolated communities, like you're saying. And then the political polarization has only made that worse, and some of that's structural, like you're implying, moving things away from things that were legitimately matters of the legislature, moving them to the courts, created this the war for the courts, so the courts have been politicized. I don't know where you guys stand on this, but I'm a big supporter of reforming our party system, or like our primary system. Because I think right now it favors the bases of the parties to establish the candidates. And I think a stronger party that was trying to win elections would give us probably more moderate candidates. That and the reason I say moderate candidates would be better is because I'm concerned with the issue of polarization. A more moderate candidate tends to want to look for big consensus, tends to want to win over the other side. They tend to want to focus on the areas that they can get, like those areas they can get more agreement on, and not scare the other side, and actually run for office to represent both sides. Because a good politician should be trying to represent not their party but their constituents, and we don't see that much at all. I mean, I don't know. It's been at least 20 years since we've seen presidents act that way, or like other politicians act that way, that they represent not just their party.
Yeah, I actually this week I'm working on what I call Article 5, which is, I've written down, and I was gonna bring this up later, but I've got like 4 or 5 hypothetical constitutional amendments that we should consider. And one of them I call a right of party, where we institute a party system into the Constitution. And the objective that I'd like to complete with that is to establish a layered party system that's similar to the way that we layer our government, so that you would have federal and state parties. That way, your state and your Fed wouldn't be working together to get power, because that kind of muddies the water between the checks and balances. And then you would have executive and House parties. Now, in my theoretical government here, we've repealed the 17th Amendment, and the states are back to the being appointed by the state legislatures. And so you would only have election of by the people for the president and then your House. And then what I would do is I would set a limit of 3 parties for the House. So you always have to have at least, there's always a space for 3 parties on the ballot. Okay. And then you would set a max of 3 parties for the executive, meaning there always needs to be 3 parties running, and which would be filled, because rich people want power. And so if you have a spot for them to get on the debate stage, somebody will take it. And so what that does is it encourages more voices in the pot at the executive level. And then I think what it would do is it would make it easier for people like John and I, who aren't part of the the inside crew inside of our district, to have an opportunity to actually run and talk about real issues, to actually get in front of voters, because right now you're kind of at the mercy of the party. And as we talked about with Tyler on Sunday, the parties kind of keep you out. Ballot access is difficult.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's all really interesting. That's all new to me. Those are new reforms, and sounds like you put a lot of thought into it. Actually, if you were interested, you should write an article for us on that. I don't know. That'd be good, because then you could share those ideas, and then give me a chance to think about them more, and give other people a chance to think about them.
I will send it your way when I get it written.
Okay, sounds good.
But so
that kind of reminds me,
we need more creative thinking like that. So
going back to your article, that we're kind of talking about the consent of the governed, and I think like the problem with the party system is a lot of people feel like they don't have a voice. Like you often hear like, oh, my vote doesn't count, and then of course the party, all the parties are like, oh, your vote always counts, like everyone should vote. But it goes back to this, like Suarez has this idea of the government comes from the consent of the people governed. And even if it's, like you talk about, like a tyrant can take power and people can accept that. Like the tyrant has power because the people implicitly accept that the tyrant is in power. Now they could rise up because it's eventually bad, but living under a tyranny is is a consent to the governed, which I think not enough people recognize. Like, you've got a problem with your local school board or something, like, you technically put the school board in power one way or another. And like like you said, like a representative should represent the people, not necessarily the power or the ideas. And like I think that's something that's missing too. That's what I appreciate from your article. Like you're bringing that to light. Like people need to remember that that they do have a voice, and there is that sort of implicit consent that gets to anything. And like that's something that someone mentioned about like laws in general. Like a bad law, isn't really and I think this is in Catholic society, like a bad law technically isn't a law because people don't follow it. And so then I don't know if that's Aquinas or something, but
Yeah,
I just kind of like
yeah,
I know
there's
that's I've heard of.
mhm.
So
Yeah, there's a lot of debate on what, but yeah, it certainly isn't law in the full sense of the term, in the sense of an ordinance of reason, if it's unreasonable, right? So that, um,
mhm.
sometimes you maybe should follow it for prudential reasons, but it doesn't have the same force as a law that's really an ordinance of reason that's somehow reasonable, in some way reasonable. Yeah, and those scholastics also, just to bring it other side, uh, the uh, the legitimately authorized leader who becomes a tyrant, um, they have a right of resistance too. So if it gets so bad, then you can resist, right? But that thankfully to this point, modern constitutionalism has helped us handle that in a more peaceful way.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Right.
that's
Yeah, you
that's
could
one of
put this in the ballot box.
Yeah,
I mean, that's one of the best things about our Constitution is it does allow for us to kind of fight with our words as opposed to our, you know, hands, feet,
yeah,
fists, guns, whatever.
mhm,
Um, and I think that's kind of
Nuclear weapon.
yeah,
yeah,
nuclear weapons, exactly. Well, I mean, but that is where we're drifting apart from that because the whole system is designed for us to fight with our words. And in order
yeah,
for us to fight with our words, we need to have a place where we
yeah,
can debate each other.
yeah,
And we need it large enough. Yeah,
mhm,
John knows what I'm talking about. Where enough of the citizenry is part of it.
yeah,
And so you might not know, but John and I are big proponents of uncapping the House and expanding the House of Representatives. And that's
yeah,
part of having more debate. Like I tell people I ran for Congress in District 10, but I know even as qualified as I think that I am for the job, I can't represent 756,000 people. I'm one person.
mhm, yeah,
There's no way that I can do it effectively. I can do better than I think the people that are there, but I still don't think I can do it well, which is why I think that we should expand it.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, you wrote an article for our website on that, and I thought that was very persuasive. Yeah, they kind of dropped the ball with that, haven't they?
What Jay Cost just wrote an article this week in the Dispatch about it as well. And
Oh, he did.
and he points out that the one group that you never hear talk about it,
Mhm.
sitting members of Congress.
Yeah, that's true.
And, and like the thing that's really frustrating, and Wexton, I know she's got health issues that she's going through right now, so like I do sympathize a little bit with her on that, but she still does hold the office. She's still my representative. I've gone to my constituent services. I've tried to get contact and be like, this is what I want you to talk about. You
Mm,
represent me. You're my voice to the federal government. And I believe that this argument deserves attention. And,
mhm.
I can't be hurt. And again, hard to blame her for what she's going through. And then at the same time, I also know that she might not hear anything that I'm saying because I'm one person in 756,000 and I know she can't do
Yeah,
that job.
yeah, yeah. No, that's right. No, that's a good idea. I like both those 17th Amendment repeal. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I'm very open to that one too.
Well, you got to debate about it, and then hopefully people talk about
Yeah,
it, and then maybe see
yeah.
what.
You definitely have to develop a large consensus. So yeah,
Yeah. So we asked Tyler.
we should probably amend the Constitution more than we do. Uh, um, as much as I mean, I love the Constitution, but it's part of the Constitution is being able to amend it. I know, and there are little things that we could be doing to improve it.
I'm a big fan of that idea. I tell people all the time, I'm like, if you really want it to be like if you're really passionate about the thing and you think that it'll be good for your country, you should work to make it a constitutional amendment. And you
Hmm.
should and when you do that, you have to build a large enough consensus of the people to get it
Yeah.
written into constitutional law that you're probably going to have, it's probably going to be pretty successful, because if you get, 65% of the population all on the same page,
Oh
they're going
yeah.
to raise a generation that's going to be
Mhm.
more than 65% of the population,
Yeah.
because they're going to have kids. They're going to have more kids than there are them, and it's going to grow. And those kids will share their ideas, and I think it just gets better and better.
Yeah.
But we don't do that enough at all.
Mhm.
Everything
Yeah.
is majority passed. It's like we
Yeah.
can barely get the votes. I mean,
Mhm.
yeah.
In
Um,
the with the Supreme Court, the matters that these very controversial and dubious decisions that make both parties feel like losing an election is the end of the world because they're going to lose those justices. I mean, that's a problem.
well, and then you're fighting to get things done in and that's not in the wrong way. If you're fighting to get it through the court, that's not the American constitutional
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
The court is a check. It is
Hmm.
not the balance
Yeah.
altogether.
Yeah. And we need a political community that backs the court for doing its job.
Yeah,
We need to say, hey, I don't like the outcome, but I'm glad they did it that way because they were doing their job.
right.
And that's their job. And we needed more people thinking like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Gorsuch had a ruling. It was within the last year. I remember reading it, and I'm going, this guy knows what he's talking about. This I can get on
Yeah.
board with. But a lot of times, and I'm not a lawyer or anything, but
Hmm.
I read probably more cases than I should, and I read it and I go, this is not my understanding of the way it should be ruled. And
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
Supreme Court justices. I'm and I, like I said, not a lawyer, so I'm a little hesitant to criticize. But at the same time,
Hmm.
it's like it doesn't seem the right way.
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, you
No,
could
I
go through the
mean,
history of the Supreme Court. Like, there's been cases where they've obviously made bad decisions. Like, I think like you said, we put too much stock in the Supreme Court, where
yeah.
if we lose an election, like, oh, that's the end of the world because we're going to get Supreme Court justices that don't agree with me on this and that. But like,
Hmm.
really, their job should just be to sort of make small decisions and sort of maybe rein in Congress. But at this point,
Yeah.
they act like Congress. Congress needs to rein them in.
So
Yeah. I actually assistant instruct for a constitutional interpretation class, and the um a lot of the cases are, if you read both if you read both the majority opinion and the concurrent opinions, and then you also read the dissenting opinions, there are a lot of cases where it's like, wow, they both have pretty strong arguments. It's tough. Um,
Mhm.
and I was, there was a case where um, a justice that I normally like uh, overturned a bunch of precedent, wanted to overturn a bunch of precedent because he thought the original ruling was wrong. And that's fine if it's obviously wrong and it's still been controversial up to this time, that's fine. But I just felt like the other side was pretty plausible too. So why don't you leave it alone at that point? It wasn't causing any major injustice. It just seemed to me like there was a lack of restraint, that um you have to they have to think really hard though. What is my role within the political community here? And the humility of being like, okay, there's times where there was a bad ruling and it needs to be over. You need to overrule it because it it was clearly wrong and it's been controversial ever since. And the side that lost on it has not gotten over it. Sure, Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Bad ruling, right? Dred Scott, bad ruling. Um, we've seen other bad rulings that remained contentious after they were done. And but there are some things that you just need to let lie. you know, if it's close
Well, going
enough.
back to amending the Constitution, you could probably argue some of those cases maybe made sense in the constitutional framework, like they were kind of allowed.
Mhm.
They were bad decisions in shape, but then we fixed those decisions by amending the Constitution
Yeah, no, that's right.
to
Yeah,
solve those problems.
yeah, I meant fix like when they were actually constitutionally wrong, and then yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's right. But yeah, no,
So,
it's not the judge's role to fix them if they're just wrong because we should have a better law.
so you
yeah.
mentioned we should have more constitutional amendments, and we
Mhm.
we kind of talked about that. When I ran, I wanted 3 constitutional amendments, and now I'm like I've got 5, right? But the one thing I noticed when I first started studying history, and part of why I started running, is if you look at the constitutional amendments, if you look at the periods of government where Congress is doing its job, which is to
Yeah.
legislate and write law to solve like the problems of society,
Mhm.
we are, things aren't perfect, but things are pretty good. If
Mhm.
you look at the spaces in between, so specifically from 1804 to 1865, we wrote 0 constitutional amendments.
Hmm.
And what happened? Civil War, right? And then from 1870 to 1913, we wrote 0 constitutional amendments. And what happened during that period of time? We had the Gilded Age, which was a boom, but then we had the tail end of the Gilded Age into the Progressive Era that was really difficult on American citizens. There was a big gap of what I call people versus concentrated power. Now, this concentrated
Yeah.
power was not in the states as the Civil War was, but in the corporation. And we had to write constitutional amendments and have a president kind of bully his way through to kind of balance things out. And then looking now, technically we wrote a constitutional amendment in 1992, but that
Mhm.
wasn't real because it was, it was from 1789, I believe. They just finally
Oh,
ratified.
yes, that one. That's right.
But so in all, it has been since 1971 since we've written a serious constitutional amendment.
Hmm.
And what that says is the people are not doing their job.
Mhm.
Congress is not doing their job.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. No, something's gone wrong um in our political community that we don't look for those areas we can all agree on, so we can make those changes, right? Because there's something to be said for um setting down uh those matters that are of high consensus, so that in ordinary politics so that minorities are protected in ordinary politics. That you don't have to worry because we got this thing protected. You know, um, whereas if you didn't, then sometimes it's easy to beat up on the minority on the daily politics. But it's good to look for those things that you can get in the Constitution that are consensus things. You know, having women's right to vote. Right, it's good to we. It's like let's just get this thing out of the way. We all agree on this. Let's do this. Right,
Yeah,
it's the right thing to do. And now women won't have to worry about their state going nuts on this. Right.
yeah.
So,
And there's, getting those things out of the way are good, but I think the most important part and is that, goes back to like government is a relationship between people and power. And
yeah.
in any relationship, the thing that makes it function and progress and grow stronger is talking. And
Yeah, that's right.
when you're writing constitutional amendments, you're having
Mhm.
serious debates with a large faction of the society. And even if you don't
Yeah.
necessarily pass them while you're in Congress, maybe it takes 5 to 10 years to get done, right? But
Mhm.
having those serious debates and having congressmen and women that actually want to do their job and have those is really important
Yeah.
because it helps the country, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And sometimes in knowing when to that with a federal government of limited to delegated and enumerated powers, sticking to those limits and that allows for healthier politics at the local level too, because people get more involved at the local level. Now, of course, you can have local tyranny, and that's where the Bill of Rights and all that stuff, incorporated, I guess.
So how do
um,
you I've
well,
been reading about this, and since you're,
mm,
constitutional law, maybe you can help me out. So how do you feel about um so the 14th Amendment, Bingham wrote it,
yeah,
John Bingham, and his kind of principle from the way I understand it was to extend the privileges and immunities, like the Bill of
yeah,
Rights, into the privileges and immunities that every American citizen is
and
guaranteed.
that's at least how some of the people understood it with it. So that's a big debate now between people if what the original public meaning was. Uh, but certainly a lot of the people who were pushing it understood it that way. Yeah, yeah.
Do you
But
so
that's clear. The big debate is like what was the public meaning?
Right, but does it serve the people
Mhm.
effectively, or does it undermine the state's authority too much? Because
Well, that's the we've been dealing with the ambiguity of that, especially in the last 120 years, and there's been this tennis game in the courts about how to deal with that ambiguity, because yes, certain rights, protected rights, are reach a high level of consensus, and those would be really good ones to have protected at the federal level, right, through incorporation, or right, like freedom of speech. There's a wide consensus on freedom of speech. People like in the U.S. like freedom of speech, and it's one of the reasons I think we're such a great country. It's like we have robust freedom of speech, and more so than other Western countries as well. Like we just have a ridiculous amount of freedom of speech, and some people complain about it. They're like, well, if there were a little bit less freedom of speech here or there, maybe it would be like this much better. Maybe, but I think the benefits of it outweigh the costs, even if on these marginal cases. But you saw in a lot of these probably judicial usurpations in their interpretation of the 14th Amendment in the last 100 years, right? Some of those usurpations were very popular. And there's been this tennis game going back and forth between, if you're going to interpret, we all know that the privilege and immunities got kicked out in the slaughterhouse cases. So now we're working with a very dubious reading of the due process clause that we've just accepted because of stare decisis, right? Because it's just so established. But you could defend it in terms of the privileges and immunities clause. Similarly with the equal protection clause, we really would have, if you are going on a textual basis, the stronger point would be to go to the privileges and immunities, because equal protection is supposed to really be dealing with the executive branch and how they enforce the law. And the due process clause is really supposed to deal with the judiciary and how they allow due process. But working with this interpretation of the due process clause that basically moves the privileges and immunities into the interpretation of in 14th Amendment due process clause, it says nobody's what's the verb they use? Not be abridged their life, liberty, and property without due process of law, right?
hold on, I have
All of these cases dealing with, for the audience don't know, the Bill of Rights originally only applied to the federal government, right? We apply them to the states through the 14th Amendment, and normally through an interpretation of the life, liberty, and property, especially liberty, in the due process clause, right? And when it's from the Bill of Rights explicitly, they call it incorporation, but the more general concept is substantive due process, and it protects certain fundamental rights that are mentioned in the Bill of Rights, and also some unenumerated rights, such as rights of parents to raise their own children. That's a famous one. But much of the controversy in the last 100 years over this has dealt with not the incorporation, which is pretty uncontroversial, except for the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is probably the most controversial of the incorporation, or when there's a loose reading of incorporation, with those famous passages about emanations and penumbra and all that, right? Those have been controversial. But the more controversial ones are these unenumerated rights that you can't find in the Bill of Rights, right? And some of them aren't. Some of them are. The more controversial cases were obviously Roe v. Wade, Casey, and then for the incorporation, the incorporation of the Second Amendment. And actually, there's controversy about how to interpret the Second Amendment, even at the federal level, but then there's further controversy about the incorporation of the Second Amendment. Just in the general times in which privacy was interpreted out of penumbra or as a substantive due, as an unenumerated right, were controversial. So there's been this tennis game because you let the genie out of the bottle, right? It was very popular to understand the 14th Amendment as protecting individual rights from states, not from the federal government, but from states, right? And of course, the federal government is just protected by the Bill of Rights and some other unenumerated rights. Um, the oh, but many once you let that genie out of the bottle, right? The 14th Amendment isn't very clear on how to interpret it, right? And normally the courts with incorporation, if you limit it to incorporation, the justices can look to those Bill of Rights to see what are the rights, the fundamental rights that are expected of a free society that are protected under this, right? But then you want to go extend beyond it to unenumerated rights, and that's where you get this game of tennis. Most recent big case was Dobbs, and Dobbs kind of reins in the interpretation of the 14th Amendment as regards unenumerated rights, right? But it goes back to a principle that has been applied several times throughout this history of this tennis match, right? But it goes back to this principle of like, okay, we're not limiting it to incorporation of the Bill of Rights. We're going to include unenumerated rights, but only those unenumerated rights that have always been protected by history and tradition, you know, and that are fundamental in a free society. So that shows up in the Glucksberg case as well, dealing with like 20 years ago, dealing with euthanasia. Now, you see the issue. The issue isn't when they're very popular, it works really nice because you know nobody wants. I mean, the free speech protection we get today is not the free speech protection we had in 1795. It's not the free speech protection we had in 1910, right? We have robust freedom of protection of freedom of speech. Now, some people are light on stare decisis. I think there's a very strong place for stare decisis. You have to have your own philosophy of stare decisis when you do this, you know, jurisprudence. If I were a judge, I would see it as a kind of usurpation to pull the rug on people in their consensus understanding of our rights, right? So like minimizing freedom of speech below what people have been used to for the last 100 years, I think would be unjustified, right? But some people who are like people like Justice Clarence Thomas doesn't really think stare decisis should be applied, and you should just go with what the original meaning of the public meaning of the text is. But Clarence Thomas would protect some freedoms because of the privileges and immunities clause, but he wouldn't protect all these like unenumerated rights, or at least the ones that.
Well, it is, and again, back to what is Congress's responsibility? Congress's responsibility is to legislate, and if there are rights that a generation wants, then a generation should work to build a consensus and write it into because if you don't do that, what you have is exactly what's happened, like you said, a ping pong match, where a small group of people interpret what is supposed to happen as opposed to building a consensus and legislating. And you know, back to what is the text? I wanted to pull this up. So, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, this was written very clearly to extend the rights to all citizens. Now we talk about the ping pong match and how things shifted, and I'd like to get your opinion on this. What about the head? Excuse me, coughing. I have to cut that out, John. So, what about the head note in the Santa Clara South Pacific case? Okay, where
Santa Clara,
where all of a sudden corporations are now viewed as persons in the law of in the eyes of the court. And this, you know, over time, you know, it is referenced, and now you have those privileges and immunities that were extended to individual citizens now extended to corporations, groups of people, which already have more power than an individual. So now you're empowering them with more. And, you know, if we look back in the courts, 1809, there were 2 court cases where the courts had ruled that corporations were subject of the states. They were created,
Mhm.
you know, for the will of the people, and therefore not, they are artificial creations. They're not citizens, and they weren't
Yeah.
entitled to the same privileges or immunities.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a really complex one. We've gone over. I don't want to share really any public thoughts on this because it is complex. I will just say that in the case of the Citizen United, if you read the opinions in that case, um, look at all of the opinions. Um, there are a lot of good points made on both sides, um, and I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying. Now, for the listeners, one clarification that gets screwed up in the media on one matter that gets screwed up on the media is the debate's not whether corporations are fictional or are legal persons. They are. The debate is whether legal persons like corporations should receive the same rights, constitutional rights, as natural persons. And Now, part of the argument in there doesn't really rely too much on on that. It just the idea is that if you have freedom of speech, you should be able to pool money to express that speech, right? Through different means. But the dissent in that case made some very good points that in the case of the Citizens United, these regulations were not preventing either the content of the speech or people from pooling their resources to express the speech. They were preventing very specific types of organizations from doing so, but you could take your money and pool it with other people in a different type of organization to express the same speech. So, I mean, I don't know. It seemed to me that the strong case can be made that the majority in that case really overstepped it. Yeah, that it was narrowly tailored. It was dealing with something that was arguably a compelling interest for regulation of speech, as far as not the content of speech, but the time, place, and manner of speech. And so you could still treat organizations as having some sort of rights extended from the persons that comprise them, and still make a strong argument, as some of the people in the dissent did, that that they just overstepped it there. That, I mean, you can go create a PAC if you want, right? And the other problem in that case was that with these if it's a corporation, right? Not all the shareholders agree with one another, and you you know, so there's an extra reason to say, hey, why don't you guys take your money elsewhere, where everyone is in an organization on the premise that they agree with what the message is that you guys are going to be pushing. So
Yeah, I,
I
I
mean,
mean,
there's a lot of things wrong in that case. I'm very sympathetic with your opposition to it.
well, and it's not necessarily like I'm opposed to the ideas. Like you said,
Mhm.
both on both sides, they make valid points.
Mhm.
I am again, my issue is I do think that it's short-sighted in its ruling because of the
Yeah.
effects that it causes.
Yeah.
And I also don't think that it's the place. Like,
Mhm.
and this is an issue that has come up in the courts for since our founding. Is how does the court understand the corporation? Like, there
Yeah.
is nothing, there's no real guidance in the Constitution about that, which
Mhm.
brings me back to my stump from tonight, which is,
Yeah.
what do you think about a citizen and corporates rights amendment where we define both of those things and we explain which rights or the rights that each of them are guaranteed?
Well, that would be good. Yeah, if you can get to a general consensus on to draw the lines a little bit more clearly, that would be a good thing. And like when I was going back about those like popular unenumerated rights we got through usurpation. Um, I'm not supporting the usurpation. I'm just saying, like, after the fact, and you might want to leave. You probably want to leave some of them alone, because they're so. But you could still amend the Constitution to codify them. Then, if they're so consensus, why not do that? And then it will sort of legitimate them a little bit and create a better political culture for these things, not make us look to the judges to do this stuff for us.
Yeah. That's what I want. I want a world where we actually govern ourselves
Yeah,
like we
yeah,
were supposed to.
yeah, yeah. No,
And
I'm with you.
and I think, studying like the history and then also studying kind of the pop culture that goes around history, reading the literature from the times and stuff. What I think is it, we just weren't ready fully to be able to govern ourselves. There weren't
Hmm.
enough people in the country that understood these concepts. And what you
Hmm.
ended up with is a lot of people in Congress that were very self-interested,
Hmm.
and they kind of lost their purpose, which I think you write about it in the article. Is like each body needs a purpose, in
Yeah.
order to be effective.
Hmm.
And but I think that we're there now. Like I
Hmm.
think that there is so many people in this country that are much more capable than the people we have in office. And
Yeah.
because of the system, it makes it hard for those people to get to office now. But all it
Hmm.
takes is something breaking through to like kind of open up, because the average citizen is really, really smart. They're
Yeah.
highly intelligent. They may
Yeah.
not understand political theory, but they
Yeah.
could if
Hmm.
politicians actually talked about it.
Yeah. No, that's right. Well, and in the um yeah, if you compare people today compared to real people in the past and not our idealizations of the past, then yeah, I would say that's probably true, right? Like 200 years ago, out of the world population, I think 90% were illiterate. You know, um, it's where we have now in the developed world, we have like 99% plus literacy. Um, and I think there are things we need to improve. I mean, I think too many of the kids now are being handed smartphones and staring at TikTok all day, and that's probably gonna might start having a dip in literacy after a while. But overall, historically speaking, we're still doing pretty well. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's right. And I think there's some connection there between education and political participation, right? Um, it's that's there's not that it wasn't an accident. And I'm a Catholic, and I'm gonna say this: the Protestants did a better job than the Catholics of teaching people how to read historically, right? Because they wanted them to be able to read the Bible. The Jesuits were the exception with the Catholics. Jesuits, wherever there were a lot of Jesuits, people read really well. Uh, but I don't think it's a coincidence that you have this rise in literacy happen just before sort of the rise of sort of modern constitutionalism and all these other good effects. So,
I agree. And that's kind of really, what I like about what you guys are doing at the Vital Center, right? This emphasis on debate. And, I don't necessarily know if it's literacy, but I think you need to be able to read the magazine, right? Like,
yeah.
because and if you don't, you're going to want to read after reading the
Oh, thank you.
magazine. And
Thank
that's, in itself a success, because, John and I, we teach classes on government in our community, right? Because
you. Mhm.
we understand the same thing that you're talking about, that education is a big part of self-governing. And
Yeah.
we we've gotten off. I would argue that it happened right after the Civil War during the Reconstruction. Education got
Mhm.
off track. Our focus shifted of what education should be to what it is.
Mhm.
And it's kind of harmed us in a lot of ways. Um, but back to the Vital Center, what got you inspired to join this project and to like, kind of breathe some life into it?
Well, I've been concerned with the issue of polarization and people talking to each other, communicating. Gadamer has this term "fusing horizons," um, and several years ago, even like when I was teaching students and when I was in grad school, and but as far as the magazine, it was Tyler's idea. He just randomly contacted me because he heard about me through somebody else, and he told me that he thought it'd be a good fit for it. And I was like, and he told me what it was, and I was like, okay, cool, because Tyler and I aren't perfectly aligned in our beliefs, which that's probably good because we balance each other. Um, he but we're within we what we kind of agree on is we kind of want to bring together these different center left and center right, centrist, um, pro-constitutional democracy perspectives to build the center, build the center, build a center of people that in the midst of their disagreement, they agree that they want a healthier political community in which we handle our disagreements in a healthier way, and that we something more sustainable, right? Because sometimes it feels unsustainable. You get out nowadays, right? And I liked the United States, and I want it to last for another 200 years at least plus, right? I want, when I die, I want it to be there for my kids, and I hope it's there for their kids. And I'm very much opposed to all this talk on some circles about national divorce, whatever. And I think we can make it work, but we have to try. And I think building the center is can contribute to that, right? And I think more people need to be involved in primaries. I consider myself an independent, but I'm going to make myself pick a primary and vote in it. And I'm going to go to the primary and I'm going to vote for what I think is the best candidate for that out of the options, or the one the best candidate has a chance, right? And I think more people who are not partisan or independents or right, need to do that too, because I still think that the median voter in the United States is pretty sane, right? So if we can empower that median voter, and to empower that median voter without any, amendments or things that you were talking about, we at least have to start showing up at the primaries and having our say there, so that the base doesn't, so we don't get to every election and it's the two awful choices.
Like we've talked about that on the last 2 weeks of the show specifically, and what I've been saying is, if you don't vote in a primary election, you should not vote in a general election, because it's not your vote and it's not your voice at that point, because you had no say in it. You just voted who the party told you to vote for.
Yeah. No, I think that's, I mean, they have these open primary, closed primary states, all this, whatever, but I'm just going to register in a party and I'm going to vote in the primary. Yeah, so even though I consider myself an independent.
Do you feel like it abridges your privileges and immunities to be kept out of the ballot box in a primary?
I don't know. I would support open primaries in my state.
No, it was just funny because I think we talked about, John, did we talk about that with Tyler too?
He mentioned that closed primaries are a go against the idea of a Republican form of government.
I just have to think about it more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think
that could be next step. That could be next issue of the quarterly. You
can,
I have an article on that.
Yeah.
We have a debate about it. Tyler could write one side, and you could write the other, and then.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm going to have that strong opinion. So it'll be an interesting article.
Well, Thomas, it's been awesome having you on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time and spending with us. John and I, we're always looking for people that want to have debate and want to kind of, like you guys are doing, build the center out. I think, John, I mean, we're kind of, that's why we felt left out, because we were kind of more in the center.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I can get that now. Yeah, that you guys were too centrist for the hardliners in the party.
Yeah, and there's some things to be said about being hardliner, but
yeah. But I mean, I'm sure you guys actually want to get along with people that are outside the party.
Well, what I tell people is, like, I'm never going to hate the Democrats, because people that I love are Democrats, and I'm not going to hate them just because you tell me that I'm supposed to hate them.
Yeah,
I can live with people I disagree with. It doesn't mean I'm not going to voice my opinion. It doesn't mean I'm going to not debate them. I'm not going to cower away, and I'm not afraid of that either. And I think that's kind of, I think more than anything on the right, from the ground level, what I see is people are afraid, and they shouldn't be. But
yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't have to worry that somebody from the other party is going to be elected. Like, it's going to be this, and a lot of the times the worry turns out to, almost all the time, it turns out to be unfounded. But politicians could make it a little bit easier on people on the other party that, I'm not going to overturn this country. It's not going to be a radical shift in your daily life, um, and I am concerned with you guys too. I'm not just running for my party. So
Yeah. So yeah, we really appreciate you being here. Keep up the great work at the Vital Center. If people, if you're listening, go check out it's thevitalcenter.com. You can find them on Twitter. You can find Thomas on Twitter at Thomas D House. He's a good follow. I like your tweets. Some of them, Yeah,
some of
but
them.
I mean, everybody only likes some of things,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
But they're thought provoking always, and that's good. I think we just need more thought. And I appreciate anybody working and putting in that time, especially a father with 2 kids, taking the time to make sure that our country has civil debate for their kids, so that it's there when they're gone. That is the American way, and I appreciate anybody working on that.
And I apologize in advance. I think I'm most pugnacious with my own tribe. So people, my fellow Catholics, if I feel like they're being misbehaving, sometimes I get a little bit pugnacious with them, but I try not to be like that. It's harder with your own tribe, right? You expect more from them. Right? So.
Yes, I think we all
Same for your family. You expect more from your children, and you expect more from your siblings.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
But your wife is always perfect.
John's trying to get some extra points today. Thomas, thank you so much for joining the show.
Oh, thank you so much. It was my pleasure. Good luck with everything, and look forward to the next issue of Vital Center. It's going to be in February 1st.
Awesome.
So, all right. Thank you.
No problem. All right. It's been a wonderful episode. John, what were your thoughts, man? How'd you like that interview?
Jeff, towards the end of it, all I can think of is, we've given the corporations the First Amendment. Let's not give them the Second Amendment.
Ooh. Oh man. I think that might be in the works someday. Corporations need their own police force and military.
That's like every dystopian novel, right? Like the corporation security forces and stuff. There's already security forces and things. Like let's not make it any worse than it already is.
I mean, isn't that kind of my argument about limiting the power of the corporation, is because a corporation is kind of just a state of its own. It doesn't have borders, but it can affect our sovereignness. Sovereignness, is that a word? Our sovereignty.
But it doesn't have borders, but it has it has a personhood in a certain sense, and that it can make decisions, it can affect things. And I think, as you were talking about, an amendment that sort of limited rights to people, real people, versus legal fictions, if you will. I think that's something that would definitely benefit everyone. I appreciate that. So I can't wait to read that article in the Vital Center.
Oh yeah, now I have to go write it. Which, let's face it, I was gonna write it anyways, whether anybody read it or not. I'm just glad to have opportunity, and awesome to be part of the Vital Center as such a fan as I am. So, again, listeners out there, we love you. We appreciate you taking the time to out of your day to listen to us ramble on about constitutional law and all things that we're just guessing, right? We're just guessing, John. And again, thank you. That's right. Thank you again to Thomas. Thank you again to Thomas, and as always, peace and love.